It was still dark when someone was already preparing for a murder that would look completely different from reality. By morning, a young mother would be dead, and witnesses would confidently describe a man who wasn't there. The strangest part wasn't simply who died, it was the identity investigators were initially given for her killer. The description sounded clear: a tall black man, dressed in dark clothing, his face hidden behind a mask. But Alyssa Burkett's mother had another name: Andrew Beard. There was one immediate problem with that name: Andrew Beard was white. So why would Alyssa's mother point police towards someone who looked nothing like the attacker? To understand that contradiction, investigators had to look beyond the parking lot. They had to look at a custody battle that had been unfolding for months. And eventually they would discover that the murder hadn't started on October 2nd. The story began much earlier with a child named Willow. Alyssa Burkett was 24 years old when her life became entangled with Andrew Beard's. They had met through a dating app in 2018. Their relationship was brief, but Alyssa became pregnant. On July 23, 2019, their daughter Willow was born. By then, the relationship between Alyssa and Andrew had already changed. The two parents eventually found themselves fighting over custody of their daughter. Andrew wanted sole legal and physical custody. Alyssa wanted to remain an active part of Willow's life. The disagreement moved into the legal system, where custody disputes are supposed to be resolved. There were court proceedings, financial disagreements, and questions about child support. For Alyssa, the issue was simple in one important respect. She wanted to remain Willow's mother in more than name. Eventually, in spring 2020, the two sides reached an agreement. There was a shared custody arrangement. Child support was established. On paper, the custody battle had reached a settlement. But settling a case on paper doesn't always mean the conflict has disappeared. In April 2020, Andrew met Holly Elkins. Their relationship developed quickly. Within weeks, Holly was spending time at Andrew's home with Willow. By May, the couple was looking at engagement rings. Holly was becoming part of the family Andrew imagined for himself and his daughter. But there was one person who could not simply be removed from that family. Alyssa was still Willow's mother. The custody agreement guaranteed that she remained part of her daughter's life. And according to the evidence later presented, that became increasingly important. Andrew and Holly began gathering information about Alyssa. The goal appeared to be finding something that could be used against her. They weren't simply watching the custody arrangement anymore. They were looking into Alyssa's private life. During the summer of 2020, GPS trackers were secretly placed on vehicles belonging to Alyssa and her boyfriend, Ben. The devices allowed someone to monitor where they went and observe their routines. Then another tactic appeared. Someone contacted emergency dispatch and reported that Alyssa was driving dangerously. The accusation described her as weaving through traffic and putting other motorists at risk. The report created an official record about Alyssa's behavior. That mattered because accusations can become powerful weapons during custody disputes. But the attempt didn't produce the result Andrew and Holly wanted. Then Holly became involved in another confrontation. This time, the dispute involved Alyssa's mother, Teresa. Holly told police that Teresa had attacked her. She showed officers scratches on her skin. Investigators examined the injuries and reached a different conclusion. The marks appeared consistent with scratches that had been inflicted by the person wearing them. The accusation against Teresa did not hold. Andrew and Holly still wanted information that could weaken Alyssa's position, so they hired a private investigator. The assignment was to look into Alyssa's life, financial problems, criminal behavior, anything that might become useful in court. But the investigator found no significant discovery that could accomplish that. Alyssa went to work. She lived an ordinary life. There was no hidden criminal history waiting to destroy her custody claim. The investigation had failed to produce what they were looking for. Then in September, something much more serious happened. Someone called emergency dispatch and claimed Alyssa was selling illegal drugs from her car. The caller identified himself as Frank. He knew where Alyssa worked. He knew the vehicle she drove. He even provided the license plate. Police went directly to the Green Tree apartment complex. They approached Alyssa and asked to search her vehicle. Alyssa agreed. When officers opened the trunk, they found drugs, cash, and a loaded firearm. For someone already involved in a custody dispute, the discovery could have been devastating. But Alyssa wasn't arrested. And later that day, she sent a message to her roommate. The message was brief. She said, "He's going to try to kill me." At the time, nobody could know how significant those words would become. Less than a month later, Alyssa arrived at work on an ordinary October morning. The Green Tree apartment complex in Carrollton, Texas, was beginning another workday. Employees were arriving. The leasing office was open. Nothing about the morning suggested that a murder was about to happen outside. Then came the sound of gunfire. Employees looked toward the parking lot. Alyssa was running toward the leasing office. Behind her was a masked attacker dressed in dark clothing. The employees inside could see what was happening, but they could not safely open the door. The attacker followed Alyssa to the entrance. The attack continued. Then the man turned away from the building and walked back toward the parking lot. By the time police and paramedics arrived, Alyssa was critically injured. She died at the scene. For the employees who witnessed the attack, one detail seemed certain. They had seen a tall black man. But Alyssa's mother had already given investigators another name: Andrew Beard. The investigation now had two apparently incompatible pieces of information. One came from witnesses, the other came from someone who knew Alyssa's life. Investigators needed to understand why Teresa had named Andrew. They also needed to understand how Andrew could possibly match what the witnesses had seen. Then the investigation produced a vehicle. Later that day, police stopped Andrew's pickup truck. Holly was with him, so was Willow. Holly told officers she was extremely protective of Andrew and rarely let him out of her sight. Her account placed Andrew with her that morning, but investigators were already looking beyond their statements. They had another vehicle to find. Less than a mile from Andrew's home, a black Ford Expedition had been abandoned on a dead-end street. The SUV had been recently purchased with cash through an online classifieds website. Investigators searched it. Inside, they found dark theatrical makeup. They found a fake beard containing Andrew's DNA. They found black synthetic hair, and they found blood belonging to Alyssa. Suddenly, the witness description began to make sense. The man witnesses remembered may not have looked like Andrew because appearance itself had been part of the plan. The disguise wasn't simply hiding someone's face. It appeared designed to make investigators search for an entirely different person. Nearby surveillance footage provided another connection. The black SUV was seen being parked. A man was seen running from it toward Andrew's home. The investigation was moving away from the idea of a random masked stranger. But investigators still had another question. What happened to the clothing and other materials used during the attack? They searched the pickup truck Andrew and Holly had been using. Inside was an ordinary-looking diaper bag, but the contents had little to do with caring for a baby. Investigators found heavy-duty trash bags. Inside were pieces of men's shoes that had been cut apart and treated with bleach. There were also makeup products and wipes apparently connected to removing the disguise. The evidence suggested someone had been trying to dispose of materials connected to the attack. Then investigators searched Andrew's home. They found equipment compatible with the GPS trackers used on Alyssa's and Ben's vehicles. They also found an unregistered firearm suppressor. Then came another discovery. Investigators found a handwritten document resembling the September report about drugs in Alyssa's vehicle. The wording closely resembled the actual emergency call. The anonymous caller was no longer looking so anonymous. The investigation was connecting the earlier setup to the murder itself. Physical evidence wasn't the only trail. Investigators also examined prepaid phones. One device contained an internet search about removing gunshot residue from hands. That search alone could not establish who fired a weapon. But investigators weren't examining one isolated search. They were building a picture from multiple pieces of evidence. The vehicle, the disguise, the DNA, the tracking equipment, the planted evidence, the anonymous calls, the purchases. Together, those details formed a much more difficult picture for the defense to explain. Investigators also examined the timing of purchases. On September 10th, a long black cloak was purchased. On September 14th, dark liquid foundation was purchased. On September 19th, ammunition and a hunting knife were purchased. Individually, none of those purchases explained a murder, but investigators were interested in the sequence. The purchases formed a timeline leading toward October 2nd, and then there was Holly. 1 week before Alyssa was killed, Holly traveled to Mexico. Her physical distance from Texas could appear important, but investigators continued examining communication between Holly and Andrew. One message became particularly important to prosecutors. Holly wrote that she needed a man who would protect his family from the entire world and do whatever it took. Prosecutors argued that the message supported their case against Holly. The question was no longer simply whether Holly knew about Andrew's conflict with Alyssa. The question was whether she had helped make the murder possible. Andrew eventually cooperated with investigators. His cooperation helped prosecutors build their case against Holly. In 2023, Andrew Beard was sentenced to 43 years in federal prison. Holly later faced trial. The jury reached its verdict in approximately 90 minutes. She was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Her legal story did not end there. Her case continued through the appeals process, making the final legal picture more complicated than the original verdict. But the central fact remained unchanged. Alyssa Burkett was dead. Her daughter Willow had lost her mother. Eventually, Teresa adopted Willow, and that brings the story back to where it began: a custody dispute. 2 parents arguing over their daughter, a legal process designed to settle that disagreement. Then surveillance. False allegations, planted evidence, a disguise, and finally, murder. The case remains disturbing because the murder wasn't an isolated event. According to the evidence presented, the conflict had been escalating long before the shooting. The investigation eventually explained the masked man's appearance. It connected the abandoned SUV to Andrew. It connected the disguise to Andrew through DNA. It connected the earlier surveillance to equipment found during the investigation. And it connected the planted drug report to a handwritten draft. But the most lasting part of the case isn't a piece of forensic evidence. It's Willow. She was the reason the custody dispute existed in the first place. Yet the dispute ultimately left her without the mother both sides had been fighting over. Alyssa went to work that morning expecting an ordinary day. Instead, she became the center of a murder investigation that began with a false identity. The witnesses saw one person. The evidence eventually pointed somewhere else. And what first looked like an attack by a stranger became a case rooted in a family conflict. That is what makes this case difficult to forget. The warning signs weren't hidden in some distant past. They appeared in surveillance, accusations, planted evidence, and escalating attempts to control a custody dispute. By the time investigators saw the full pattern, Alyssa could no longer speak for herself. Her family was left to deal with the consequences, and Willow was left to grow up without the mother whose custody had started the entire conflict. The investigation answered who prosecutors said was responsible. The convictions answered the legal question. But another question remains harder to settle. At what point does a fight over custody stop being about custody? For Alyssa's family, that question came too late. For Willow, the consequences became permanent. And for investigators, the case became an example of how a staged crime can begin with one story and end with another. The masked stranger was never the real mystery. The real mystery was how far the conflict had already gone before the murder exposed it. If you followed the evidence with us, share your thoughts respectfully below. And if there is another historical crime case you think deserves this kind of investigation, tell us about it. Subscribe if you want more real cases examined through the evidence, the people, and the history behind them.